The new era of Bitcoin and blockchain. When you discuss with people about the use case for blockchain, especially the payment use case for Bitcoin, people usually they will criticize the performance of the Bitcoin, such as it can only process 7 transactions per second versus the PayPal or Visa can process thousands of transactions per second, which is scalable to several millions per second. It is true when Bitcoin was designed, each blocks take 10 minutes to produce, and it takes around 1 hour to confirm your transaction. As technology evolves, researchers is looking for different ways to scale Bitcoin, such as increase the block size or segregated the signature, which is called segregated witness. But those techniques doesn't help much to scale the Bitcoin. And today I'd like to talk about the payment channel and the Lightning Network, which probably I'll talk about in the next video. It is the groundbreaking invention to the blockchain technologies because people are thinking of don't put every transaction on chain. There's an option. You put additional layer on top of the blockchain, and we call it layer 2. Those transactions are not recorded on the blockchain, which may not even be needed to be recorded on blockchain, but it increases the performance, the TPS, the transaction per second, dramatically. So in general, if Alice wants to pay Bob, she just needs to deposit some amount of the Bitcoin into a third party. So third party is nothing but a Bitcoin script, or we call it a multi-sig address. This deposit is on-chain. Once that is settled, the payment channel has been created. All the following transactions, Alice paid Bob daily or thousands of transactions per second is achievable because all the transaction is happening just between Alice and Bob, and all those transactions are not even sent it to the Bitcoin network, are not even recorded on blockchain, as it doesn't have to. All the transactions come and go between Alice and Bob. It's just decide how they're gonna split the deposit. Let's still use Alice and Bob for example. Alice is a customer and Bob owns a coffee shop. Alice goes to have coffee quite often, like once or twice a day. It's better they have a payment channel to lower their transaction fees and have a higher throughput of their transactions. So the first thing Alice needs to do is to create a payment channel. So we have Alice and Bob. Alice first, they create a payment channel with some deposit. So the payment channel, Alice create a transaction to a third party, which is a multi-sig address. You can treat it as a machine or a code that nobody can spend the coin unless both Alice and Bob signed. So the transaction, so let's use M, for example, to represent this address, since it's a multi-sig. And the transaction will look like this is input, this is output. So the input is from somewhere Alice got those, for example, 10 Bitcoins. So this is from Alice pre-transaction, which has this 10 Bitcoin. And the output is this multi-sig address, and with a script. It's a pay-to script hash. You need to have 2 of 2 multi-sig, which means you have both Alice and Bob sig to spend this deposit. Okay, we have day 1, transaction 1. Alice buy a coffee from Bob, and that coffee is kind of expensive, like 1 Bitcoin. Instead of, so the deposit has to be sent to the Bitcoin network. So which means you open the payment channel, it may take up to 1 hour to secure the fund. So this fund is secured in Bitcoin network and nobody can use it unless both Alice and Bob sign a transaction to reference into this transaction. So day one, Alice buy 1 Bitcoin coffee from Bob. At this point, both Alice and Bob need to create transaction to each other. So the transaction Bob creates looks like this. You have input, you have output. So the input is to spend the deposit. So basically all the transaction between Alice and Bob is to decide how to split this deposit, no matter how many transactions in between. So it's just this transaction need to referencing to the fund transaction. This transaction has to be signed by Bob. It has to have Bob's signature. And since Alice buy 1 Bitcoin from buy 1 Bitcoin coffee from Bob, so the output would have 2 output. The first transaction is the Bob's public key address, and Bob will get 1 Bitcoin since this is for the coffee. The other output is Alice key plus some amount of time. Let's, for example, 100 blocks away. By the way, so if you haven't seen my video about revocable transaction, this is required to understand the whole thing. I will leave a link in this video. Go and check out that video first and then go back to here. So here Alice will have the output is Alice key and wait for some time. That means after some point of time, Alice will be able to spend it. Or Alice revocable key and Bob's key. This is also a multisig, which means if Bob have Alice revoke key, and since Bob has his own private key for sure, he can start using it even before 100 blocks away, which means this transaction will be revoked. If Alice broadcasts this to network, Bob still can revoke it by using this multisig. So this has 9 BTC. Okay, so this is the transaction Bob sent to Alice, and Alice can get it and sign it so that we'll have 2 signature and then broadcast to the network. But given at this time, it's not necessary. The transaction will keep go on. Alice doesn't want to close this payment channel, and Alice needs to send to Bob a reverse transaction similar to this one. So what it looks like. So this one still referencing to the same fund transaction, and this one signed by Alice. So the output is Alice, the public key, Alice address. She will get 9 Bitcoin, and Bob's key, and sometime 100 blocks, and or Alice and Bob's reverse key. This one has 1 Bitcoin. So this transaction is the reverse transaction of the previous one. Everything is the same. They found the same way. Alice has 9 Bitcoin, Bob had 1 Bitcoin. The difference is the one Bob sent to Alice, the Bob can spend the 1 Bitcoin right away and hold for some time until Alice can get back her 9 Bitcoin. Otherwise, the transaction can be revoked. Similar, the second one is Alice signed this transaction, and the output is Alice can spend the 9 Bitcoin right away, and pay Bob the 1 Bitcoin, then Bob can start using it after some time, or the transaction can be revoked. Both transaction is signed only by one party, so in order to spend the output of the fund, the other party need to sign the transaction and broadcast to the network. But at this time, nobody really need to do that. That's the beauty of the payment channel. So you hold the ownership of the transaction at this point because the other party already signed it. But you don't actually broadcast to the network. But you still can do it anytime you want. But given that at this time, for example, Alice buy another coffee from Bob, right? So what needs to be done? So that it's the same thing. So that Bob send this transaction, a new transaction, which is similar to the Bob sent to Alice, that the input is the fund transaction and Bob signed, and the output is the Bob address. But at this time, Bob will have 2 Bitcoin since Bob already sold 2 coffees. And this time is Alice key, and wait for some time. 100 blocks it's about 1 day, or it's the Alice reverse key and Bob's key. This is for 8 Bitcoin. Basically, this money is for Alice, if not revoked. But it has to wait. Alice cannot just go and grab it. And same, Alice create a reverse transaction similar to this one, in and out, reference to the same fund. Alice signed, and at this time, Alice's address will have 8 Bitcoin, and this is the Bob's key. Bob has to wait for some time, or it's the Alice key and Bob's reverse key, or it will be revoked. But it's not done yet. Since the new transaction has been created, so the Bob need to send the Bob's reverse key to Alice, and Alice need to send Alice's reverse key to Bob. Why doing that? Because since you already have my previous transactions, I want to make sure you don't broadcast it. How do I make sure you don't broadcast it and you delete it? Is by sending my reverse private key. It's like, even though you keep it and you broadcast the previous version, I still can spend the money. Because for every transaction, there are some time the money has to be held. But if I have you revocable key, I'm sorry, did I say reverse key? It has to be revocable key. I can spend it right away. So both parties can keep doing this exercise again and again. So the capacity of this channel is 10 Bitcoin. They cannot have a transaction more than 10 Bitcoin because all the transaction, they just negotiate how they're gonna split the fund. The total transaction cannot exceed the fund. They can do the transaction in a really high TPS. It doesn't rely on the process time of the block producing. It's just based on the network A and B, Alice and Bob, how Alice sent the transaction to Bob. Because when someone hold it, they can just have the authority to broadcast it. Once they decided, say, okay, I'm done. This is my last transaction. I'm gonna broadcast it. So whenever the transaction
let's for example, this is the last transaction they're gonna broadcast it. Either Alice want to broadcast it. So what Alice does is she got this transaction and sign it. So the transaction will have both Alice's signature and Bob's signature and send to the network. So this transaction is the on-chain transaction. It's actually broadcast to the Bitcoin network. And once that is done, because once this transaction is done, without the following transaction, Alice and Bob, they didn't exchange the revoke key unless there's a following transaction, and then they exchange revoke key. But doing that, so Bob doesn't have Alice a revoke key. So once Alice broadcasts this, Bob get this 2 Bitcoin right away. He can just spend it, and Alice just has to wait for 1 day until she can use the 8 Bitcoin. Bob doesn't have Alice's revoke key, so Bob cannot do anything.
Now we know what is payment channel. The researchers push this into a next level, that the payment channel can not only be used between two parties, it can be connected to form a network. We call it the Lightning Network. I will talk about it in the next video. Thanks for watching. Subscribe this channel if you like it. See you next time. Bye.